So in this week we're going to look at the appendicular skeleton. So appendicular skeleton, again referring to the arms and the legs, the pelvic girdles, and the shoulder girdles. So we've got those four areas we're going to look at. Most importantly, we've already done a little bit of work on, right or left bones, which one's which. We're really going to hone in on that today. Now, we're not going to learn all the landmarks in one hit. So today, more than anything, I'm going to give you just a couple of really key landmarks, and we're going to start using that, correct anatomical names of these landmarks. We're going to target just a few. Now, the reason we're going to start with a few is because, number one, hard to learn hundreds at a time, but the ones we've selected are not so much the most important, but really good ones to learn right and left from and top and bottom from. So from just a few landmarks, we can go a long way to learning which bone is which and where it goes. Also, some of the landmarks we're going to teach you today, there's a lot going on here. Like you might have a lot of muscles and a lot of ligaments attaching to this part. Some have got very few things attaching there, and some have got a whole lot attaching there. So they're going to become more used throughout the course. So we'll target the most specific ones. We're going to go from the shoulder girdle down the arm into the hand, and the pelvic girdles down the leg into the foot. And by the end of this lesson, we should really have a handle on which bone's which, some key landmarks, and really starting to get that right and left a bit more down pat after all of this. So when we're looking at the clavicle, there's not a whole lot of landmarks that we have to remember on this. The main point is remembering, as we've touched on before, just which end is which. So for starters, we've got the sternal end. The sternal end of the clavicle is a much blunter end, whereas the acromial end is a much flatter end. And the acromial, that's a landmark related to your scapula. So it gets this name. So this is the shoulder end, the scapula being your shoulder. This attaches to your scapula, and this attaches to your sternum. So we know this is medial, we know this is lateral because the sternum's in the middle of your body and the shoulder is on the lateral side of your body. Now, top is relatively smooth. You can notice it's all the same exterior. When we flip it over, you can see it's this deeper groove going on here. There's some lumps and bumps. You don't actually need to know all the names of these for the purposes of what we're doing, but you just need to know what the top and bottom look like. So that faces down. And at the shoulder end here, this acromial end, it's actually flicking towards the front. You'd probably want to make a note of that in your lab book, that at the acromial end, it goes forward. It S-shapes forward. So I know that if I'm looking down upon this at the top, I know this is the medial and this is the lateral, and I know the S is going forward at the shoulder, then this must be the right clavicle. It has to be the right, because it's going forward at the shoulder, and I know this is on the lateral side. So they're the key points here. Which end is which? The top being this smooth, bottom being this groove with the lumps and that, and the fact that it's going forward at the acromial end. They're the key points to take and to remember from that. Now, this is the scapula, and the scapula along with the clavicle form your shoulder girdle. So when we talk about shoulder girdle, like how many bones might make up a shoulder girdle, it's two. These two bones make up that shoulder girdle. So the scapula has a couple of really key landmarks on it. For starters, remember what the front and back looks like. We know that the front has got this smooth basin-like depression. This is actually called the subscapular fossa. Fossa means a shallow-like depression. On the back, you've got this ridge across the back, which is actually called the spine of the scapula. So now we're saying the back has got this spine running across it. There's a fossa above and below, supraspinatus fossa and infraspinatus fossa. So again, they're a little bit technical. We're going to come back to those in future weeks as to where they derive their meanings from. But for now, we've got the front being this nice smooth, and the back's got this spine running across it. Now, these three landmarks here are really critical to remember with the scapula, because so much happens around these points. It's a defining point of origin and insertion for so many muscles and ligaments. This one here at the front is called the coracoid process. The coracoid process is this lump out the front here. You can see it's slightly lower than this other one, which is called the acromion. So you have a look at it from a different view. It's lower, it's smaller, it's sticking out the front. If you were to palpate around the front of your shoulder, like straight on the front, you're often feeling this landmark right here. This is the coracoid process. A lot of things attach here. This one up here is called your acromion, the acromion. And that is when we said the acromial end of the clavicle. That's actually where your clavicle is connected to in the front part of the body. So this is how, at this area here, is how the clavicle and the scapula come together at the acromion. Finally, we have the actual socket itself called the glenoid cavity. Glenoid cavity is the socket where the humerus connects in, causing the allowing that ball and socket joint to take place. So coracoid process, acromion, and glenoid cavity are three really key landmarks that you want to make note of. Take a note of them in your book. You'd want to circle them. You'd want to remember them. They're going to come back around many, many times over. So this then, again, socket's got to be on the outside. I'm looking at my front. This has got to be the right scapula because I'm looking at the front and the shoulder would come down like this. So this is a right scapula. This here is a humerus. We know it's a humerus. There's a couple of distinguishing features of the humerus. Feature number one, you've got the ball at one end. This is the head of the humerus. This spherical ball forms part of a ball and socket joint. Down the other end, we've got this hourglass type structure. It's actually called the trochlea in here, this hourglass shape, which creates that elbow joint, if you like. And this two lumps on either side, and this one here is a lot more predominant than this side here. This is called the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and this is the lateral epicondyle. And what an epicondyle is, it's a lump, if you like, that's on top of a condyle. Now, what's a condyle? A condyle is another lump that's on the end of a bone. So if this whole area could be called like a condyle, and we see it a lot more in lower legs, this here is called an epicondyle. It's just the outer side of that lump. So right here, that is the epicondyle of the humerus. This is the medial epicondyle. On our body, that's that lump on the inside of your arm, of your elbow there that you might be feeling. It's a medial epicondyle. On the back, you've got this big hole. We've been calling it a hole, but it's the olecranon fossa. Again, we said a fossa before was a basin-like depression. So this is the olecranon fossa. So we know the olecranon fossa is on the back. And we know that this must be the medial side because the medial epicondyle is far more protruding than the lateral. So this actually must be, I've actually picked up a left humerus here because I'm looking at the front and I know this is the medial side. Therefore, this must be a left humerus. Now, where the actual U of this ulna, this is an ulna now coming into play, the U of the ulna creates that joint, if you like, with the humerus. So this here, we had the hole in the back of the humerus being the olecranon fossa. This is called the olecranon process. So the actual tip of your elbow is called the olecranon process. So we've got the U of the ulna with the olecranon process. So if I was going to circle or make any notes of the ulna, I would say that the U obviously represents that it is the ulna. We've got the olecranon process on the back. Now in your books, like you may not be able to label front and back in every picture because in your books you're looking at the front, so that U becomes not really clear. It's the angle in which it's on. You'd have to rotate it to the side. On the other end, you've got this point. This point here is called the styloid process. Now it occurs on both the ulna and the radius. So this is on the ulna. This would be the styloid process of the ulna. So one thing, again, challenging to determine right from left with the ulna is where does the radius sit? We know that the ulna sits on the medial side of your arm, the radius sits on the lateral side of your arm. So we're looking for this little notch in here. Right there is where the radius sits. So just like that. And it's able to rotate and pivot inside that little groove. So when you pick up an ulna, you find that U, you know that U is like this, my elbow's here, so I'm looking front on at it. I'm trying to find that little nook right there in the side to determine where my radius might spin inside it. And that's a real key part. It's going to be hard to label in your book because they're actually joint together, but you'd want to point right between where these two bones are and say, look for the notch where that head of the radius is kind of connecting into the side of that ulna. Because that'll tell you that this must be a right ulna. It must be a right ulna because the radius is on the lateral side of it. And when I'm looking straight at my arm, the radius is always on the outside. So I have to be looking at my right ulna. And when I look at my radius, it's got some features. The head of the radius, we've mentioned before, is this round, completely round spherical end. And we've said there's this lump on the top here. This is actually called the radial tuberosity. Radial tuberosity is a really common insertion because it's the insertion for the bicep brachii. And we're going to get to muscles in later weeks, but the bicep brachii, it's going to come up a lot, which means, you know, the more we talk about the bicep brachii, the more we're going to end up talking about this radial tuberosity. Tuberosity just being a broad, rough projection. So a bit of bone that's sticking out that some muscle's going to link onto. We said this point here goes towards the thumb. Well, look, now we've named the point. We named it on the ulna. This is the stylo process of the radius now. So the stylo process of the radius, which means when I take them both together, there's my ulna and my radius together, I've got these lumps on opposing sides. And in your wrists, that would be like if you felt both sides of your wrists and you can feel real lumps. Even better if you kind of turn it over, you can see that's the ulnar one there you can see sticking out and feel sticking out there. You're feeling these two lumps of the stylo processes. So again, if I've got the radial tuberosity facing up, I've got the styloid process of the radius facing the thumb. This must also be a right radius. These two go together. Now, when I look at these together, they don't actually always sort of lie, they're next to each other, obviously in the forearm, but they are kind of slightly off center. And if I saw this one and arm all together, I'll notice that it's only the ulna really coming into making that joint with the humerus. The radius, whilst it comes right up to the humerus, sometimes this gap could be even closer, it's actually not forming part of the elbow joint. This elbow joint is created between the ulna and the humerus, with the radius just coming up to it. So that's creating a hinge joint, like that. But at the other end, it's the radius that's the bigger end, with the ulna being the smaller end, and the radius making up all of this wrist joint. So this is the radius and these are the carpals. It's the wrist joint actually called the radiocarpal joint. So the radius into the carpals makes up most of the wrist, with the ulna sort of going to the wrist but not forming part of that joint. The other end's the opposite. The radius goes to the elbow, but it's the ulna that forms the elbow joint here, or the hinge joint, as the olecranon process fits into the olecranon fossa. All right, hand. We've got 8 carpal bones. Now, difficult to see in this, but they're often described as sets of 4. So there's actually 8 here if I count them out. They're hard to see. Some of them are really hard to see. It's 1, 2, 3, and there's actually one on top of it here. So that's a 2 there. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. And then here you've got 1, and there's a little one there, 2, 3, 4. And this fourth one here's got this hook on it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there's 8 carpal bones make up your wrist bones. Then you've got these long bones protruding from the carpal bones. They're called metacarpals, and they're actually labelled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from the thumb side. I know this is my thumb because it's got only 2 phalanges. So I've got 5 metacarpals, then I've got my phalanges protruding from those. Phalange, 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 all these are phalanges. But notice here that the thumb has only got 2, but every finger has got 3. So even just take a look at your own finger. I bend a finger in half, there's 3 sections to it. Whereas the one I bend the thumb in half, there's only 2 sections to it. So the thumb is missing a phalange. Which one do you think it's missing? Give me a check. This has got a proximal, middle, distal. What must this have? Everyone's thinking something in their head. Well, the answer is it's missing the middle. It always has a proximal, it always has a closest, it always has a distal, it's always got a furthest, but it doesn't always have a middle. So I want everyone now to think about this hand and think, if I was going to put, say, a ring on this in a normal ring position, where might I put the ring? Think about it, like if a ring would slid on a finger, on a normal ring finger in a normal position, where might it be? People are going to have a lot of different answers here, but I'm willing to bet there's at least some of you thinking around here somewhere. Now, if that were the case, then you would have this mini small hand and these out of control fingers, which is clearly not the case at all. It would be around here. This is what we'd be talking about. In other words, the area of confusion here is, where does the actual fingers start? It starts there. That's like my fingers there. All of this is inside the hand. All of this is the fingers protruding from the hand. So it's only the phalanges that come out. The metacarpals are inside your hand. And you can see that if you feel across the back of your hand, you actually feel those long bones. That'd be like feeling these long bones of the metacarpals. So there's a couple of easy ways to remember what these carpals are called and how many there are. So again, I mentioned there was 8 bones of the carpals. Now, we start by drawing a simple two rows of 4. Now, I'll draw these bones coming out of it, so there must be 5 metacarpals coming out of it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Must be 5 coming out of it, like that, not to scale obviously. Now there must be 2 phalanges coming out of my thumb, and then 3 phalanges coming out of all the others. All right, so if I were to label, let's start by labeling these. This would be number 1 metacarpal, 2, 3, 4, and 5 metacarpal. These would also be labelled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th phalange. So if I wanted to name this, I'd say 2nd metacarpal. If I wanted to say which finger's this, I'd say the 4th phalange. To go into more detail than that, I can say proximal, middle, and distal for each of those sections. So this one here would be a proximal and distal. Proximal, middle, distal, and so on. Obviously doesn't occur here. So when I come back to the hand, if I said, I want everyone now just to think for a moment, and I said specifically, what is the name of this bone right here? You would answer 2nd proximal phalange. If I were to ask, all right, what's the name of this bone right here? You would answer 5th middle phalange. If I were to say, what's the name of this bone right here? You would say 3rd metacarpal. Now, when we talk about the thumb, it's actually got a specific name when you add these both together. It's called the pollex. So whilst this is the first phalange, just for the thumb, it's got its own specific name called the pollex. Everything else, individual bones. So that's also the first distal phalange. Together, that's the pollex, and so on. So thumb's just a little bit different. Now we go back here, and we label these carpal bones. Again, I'm trying to distinguish what each of these little things are. And I start by a mnemonic. Sally left the party to take Kathy home. That gives us the first letter of each of these bones, which will be scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. Now, I know that is a little bit fast and hard to remember the first time around. Remember, in the back of your lab books, you do have a fully labelled appendix section that can help if you don't get the correct labelling in your lab books all done. So use that if you need to, but you really should have a chance now, or a turn, to try and label your lab book, see if you can at least put this in order. Now, when it comes time for assessment, we're going to have to know what all of these are. But in the first instance, what I want you to know how to do is to be able to at the very least, put the correct letter in the correct spot. So when we come back and I say, which bone's that? You need to be able to go, where does it start? Where does this rhyme start? That's 1, 2, 3, 4. right? Starting point is this long, flatter one on the bottom. It's scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, that little one, capitate, that big one, and hamate, this one here. It's even got the little hook on it. H for hook, H for hamate. This pisiform here is a real giveaway too, because it really can only be seen when you look at the inside of the hand. So when you look at your hand, that you can feel a lump in the bottom corner. That's the pisiform that you can feel. If I were to flip this over, and I counted these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's a clear 7. I can't really see that pisiform because it's only really available for view in the anterior view. So I must be looking at the front of this hand. I have to be, because I can see the pisiform. If my thumb is on this side, I've got to be looking at my right hand, front of my right hand. So we went through this mnemonic once to remember. That was Sally left the party to take Kathy home. We did have a situation a couple of years back where someone said, that's a terrible, moniker. It sounds terrible. I'm never going to remember that. And we came up with a new one for them, which was some lovers try positions that they can't handle. Now that was appropriate at the time. The person, seemed to take somewhat offense, but you can remember whichever you like. It doesn't actually matter. It does not matter which system you use to remember what these are, just so long as you know when we point at a bone which one it is. Now I will say that this only works when you start at the thumb side and you go across the bottom, and then you go back to the thumb side and you go across the top. Now that is very, very important, because you could have the different hand. I think in your lab book, now that I'm just remembering, you might even have the opposite hand. Let me just check on that. It's very interesting, right? Oh, it's great. You guys have got the exact opposite hand, which would be an exact mirror image of this if I did something like that, right? So this is a classic example, right, where you need to go from the thumb side across the bottom and then the thumb side across the top. Now the reason we teach it thumb across the bottom, thumb across the top, is because it doesn't matter which hand you're using and which way it's facing, you'll always get it right if you start at the thumb side and go across the bottom, back to the thumb side and go across the top. I'll give you an example. If I use my right hand, I'm going to go thumb across the bottom, thumb across the top, right? I can't say right to left or left to right, because if I flip my hand over, thumb across the bottom, thumb across the top, I'm now going in the reverse direction. Look at my left hand, it's the same. Thumb across the bottom, thumb across the top, thumb across the bottom, thumb across the top. So don't remember it right and left. Don't remember it from one, side of your hand to the other. Just remember, it doesn't matter which way you're looking at your hand, if you go from the thumb side across the bottom and then thumb side across the top, the order will always be the same. Okay, so individually here we have a coxal bone. Now this being coxal bone, a little bit of an area of confusion is, what's a coxal bone, what's a pelvic girdle, what's a pelvis? So to put that straight, one of these bones individually is a coxal bone. Together they form the pelvic girdles, so two bones make up the pelvic girdle. And then if we add the sacrum and the coccyx in the middle, so they join like that, that is my pelvis. So there's three distinctly different things there. One coxal bone, two bones form the pelvic girdle, and then all of these combined forms the pelvis. So if I just look at one individual coxal bone, there's a couple of regions that we need to identify. So on your picture, you can see them in bold, the three regions being the ilium, which is this top region. I'll flip it over, it might be easier. The top region up here, so about halfway to this acetabulum and up. You've got the ischium, which is the back rounded section. You can see that's rounded, that's what you sit on. And then the pubis, which is this pointy part facing forward. So these three regions form one coxal bone. So the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And it's something you might want to look up. The shading in your book's a little bit hard to distinguish where these regions are. Cuts about halfway through this acetabulum. Everything above is the ilium, cutting straight through this bridge at the bottom, behind ischium, and in front pubis. So these three regions of the coxal bone. This socket, as I just mentioned before, is called the acetabulum. Acetabulum being the socket where the head of the femur goes into there, forming the ball and socket joint of your hip. Now, there's another key feature I'm going to bring up now, which is this landmark at the back here. This is called the ischial tuberosity, right? The whole area is the ischium, but the ischial tuberosity is this raised section on the back. It's a really common origin for all our hamstring muscles. So we sit on it, something like that, right? All our hamstrings connecting to the ischial tuberosity. So that helps us because we know if this is the back, I'm looking at the front of it. We know the acetabulum is here. I must be looking at the front of the right leg because my leg's going to come out on this side. So front of the coxal bone on the right hand side. Next we're going to the femur. So the femur has a couple of distinguishing features on it. The femur has the head, this big spherical ball on it. Very easy to distinguish with the narrow neck. So it comes off the shaft into a narrow neck and expands into this spherical ball. The other end of our femur has got these two large condyles. So you'll notice in your book, again, it says epicondyle, meaning these raised sections on the outside. And then the whole ball is the condyle. So again, an epicondyle is a lump on the whole condyle. So this is called a femoral condyle. This is called a femoral condyle. This outside part is called a femoral epicondyle. That's a femoral epicondyle. Now you'll notice this one here is a little bit bigger, sort of protrudes a little bit lower. So if you're looking at this end, the bigger one is on the medial side. So this here is the medial side of the leg. Also, you're looking at this end, you can see here it's on the medial side because this is going to obviously connect into your coxal bone. Other things are, you've got these two structures here called the greater trochanter and lesser trochanter. Now, trochanters only occur on the femur. So you'll only hear those terms referred to here. They're a large blunt projection or process, basically a large blunt bit of bone that comes off. This one here looks a little bit more rounded, quite large, quite blunt. A lot of bigger muscle groups are going to eventually attach in here once we learn those. So greater and lesser trochanter, and you can clearly see them when you look at it from the back. When you look at it at the front, you can see them still here and here, but the ridge between them isn't so clear. So I know I must be looking at the front. I know this must be the medial side, which means this must be a right femur. The key take-home messages are, we know our greater and lesser trochanter, our medial and lateral condyles. The groove here is at the back, with the shiny flat surface here being the patellar surface. Now, that comes together with our tibia. So we've got a tibia. And I've discussed before this lump on the front and the very much back, it very much cuts away in comparison. So the front has got this lump, the back is cut away. This is called the tibial tuberosity. So tuberosity, we've heard that before. We heard it with the radial tuberosity, this broad, rough projection. This is an area where all your quadriceps come down and connect to. It's a lump just below your knee, linking down into the shaft. And this would be your shin bone running all the way down here. So we know we're looking at the front because the tibial tuberosity is evident. When we look at the other end, we've got this sort of spike sticking out on the medial side. Now this is actually your ankle bone on the medial side. And this is called the medial malleolus. So the medial malleolus, you'd make note of that. So tibial tuberosity and medial malleolus are two really important ones to circle and remember, because the tibial tuberosity will give you the front from back, and the medial malleolus will give you the inside from the outside. So we know that this is the medial side. So this must be your right tibia. It's got to be the right because I'm looking down, I'm looking at the front. This is the inside. We know this is the inside bone of your lower leg. So if this is going to be your ankle bone, it's got to be the medial, it's got to be the right tibia. Because when I add the fibula to it, it looks like that. And this represents, just sort of put it in like that, this represents my two ankle bones, medial and lateral ankle bones. So you can feel them sticking out the bottom of your own legs. Medial malleolus, therefore on the fibula, is the lateral malleolus. And I'll say this nice and clear because people often morph between these. This is the tibia. This is the fibula. Some people go with some kind of hybrid tibula and fibia. I'm never going to say that wrong again, don't worry. Like, that's just to get that out of your mind. Tibia and fibula, right? Remembering what those are. So we've just named this end here, this sort of protruding flatter end that kind of just flares out a little bit. That there is the lateral malleolus. And that's different from this head of the fibula, which has got this sort of spike coming off the head. And that connects just up underneath the tibia like that. So it touches the tibia like that, making a nice little plane joint. And at this end here, you've got the medial and lateral malleolus. So the fibula, if you look at it like that, never actually really comes into contact with this sort of knee joint here. It's much higher. So it's coming in below that joint. So fibula, probably one of the hardest. You need to know the head, because it's got the spike at the back, so you know you're looking directly at the front of it when you look at it like that. You look at this end, flares out, and you can see it's cut away there. That's the inside, that's the outside. So lateral malleolus on the outside, it means you're looking at the front of the fibula. Front right. This must be right there. So when we look at the foot, the actual foot is very similar to the hand. It's similar that it's got the same 14 phalanges, with the big toe labelled number 1 and the smallest of your toes labelled number 5. So 14 phalanges, meaning there's 2 on the big toe and 3 on each of the other phalanges. So that is literally identical to the hand, where the thumb had 2 and all the other fingers had 3. So the thumb has your proximal distal phalange, your big toe has a proximal distal phalange, and all the other toes have got proximal middle distal, proximal middle distal, proximal middle distal, all labelled 1 through 5. The thumb had a special name. It was called the pollex. In the big toe, these 2 phalanges combined is called the hallux. So, I don't know, the thumb and the toe think they're special. They get their own little name. None of the others get their own name. So this is actually called the hallux. Thumb was called the pollex. But other than that, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 phalanges, proximal distal, proximal middle distal, proximal middle distal, and so on. These in the hand were called the metacarpals. In the feet, they're called the metatarsals. Again, labelled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the same kind of thing occurs that if I said, what's the name of that bone? You would say the 3rd metatarsal. If I said, what's the name of that bone? You would say the 4th middle phalange, and so on. So the actual naming is almost identical to the hand. And then in the foot, you've got 7 tarsals. All these bones in here, these are all tarsal bones. Different from the wrists had 8 carpals, the foot's got 7 tarsals. So there's 1 different bone. In the hand, you had 27 bones in total. This has got the same amount down here, but 1 less here means there's 26 in the foot. So there's a way of trying to remember what these tarsals are, much like the way we try to remember what the wrist was. So let's start by just drawing a picture of a foot. I don't know, it's going to be something like this. Let's get creative. All right, see, look at that, exactly the same. And off the front of that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's 1, 2. That's my 5 metatarsals. Then 2 phalanges off the first, and 3 off the rest. All right, so how do I remember the name of these? So there's another, again, the other mnemonic we used with the wrist, which was that Sally left the party to take Kathy home, or the way in which we asked people to remember. You know, there's the other one we invented with that guy that some lovers try positions that they can't handle. Some of that stuff, that first one in particular, is found in textbooks. With the foot, there's actually no rhyme written in textbooks. See, your Marriott textbook actually has that Sally left the party to take Kathy home. This one here, but doesn't have anything. So a few years back, we ran a competition, and we said, you know, who can come up with a rhyme for the foot that you know, that people can remember. And as voted by the class, we'll use that in future learnings. So what this person actually came up with was, Courtney told Nicole chlamydia lives in me. Now, obviously that is not a good way of remembering, I think. The calcaneus talus navicular cuboid, and then you had the medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, and lateral cuneiform. So that was one way to do it. This person went, Courtney told Nicole, chlamydia lives in me. Other notable mentions were tiger cubs nibble milk with a C. I think that's pretty good. Someone went this like out of control one, which was, my cousin in Canada liked cooking creamed corn on Thursday nights. Starts getting a bit confusing, but really it doesn't matter which way you learn it, which method you're using. It doesn't matter at all, as long as you actually remember which one is which. So that is the calcaneus, that is the talus, that is the navicular. So the talus here sort of has that front bit. This is the cuboid, and then at the front you've got the three cuneiforms, medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiform. So again, when you see this, types of things we're interested in is if we just said, name that bone, for now, you should know that it's the letter C. Moving forward, as we get better at which one's which, we need to know that's the cuboid. So right now I could say, what is the letter of that bone? You say I. What is the letter of that bone? You would say N. What is the letter of that bone? You would say C. But what we want to get from you is calcaneus, talus, navicular, cuboid, and then your three cuneiforms, medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiform. Now, like the hand, the foot has many small bones in it. Now with the hand, you've got a lot of small bones because of these fine movements. In the foot, you've got a lot of small bones because you've got this like adapting to uneven terrain. So think about the way your foot moves. It's got to adapt to a lot of uneven terrains, and it's these many small bones and many small joints which makes that possible. So in your books, you should be able to not only label the sections of the metatarsals and phalanges, but you should at the very least be writing the correct letters on top of the bones so that you know that when you are asked which one's which, you're able to do so. Now we're completing the appendicular skeleton. So at the end of this tutorial and the end of this week, what you really want to have under control is knowing what all those bony landmarks that we've told you today are. Not all of them in the book, but those key ones that helped us determine front from back and left from right. And we're going to add to that in future weeks, but most of them we just gave you 2 or so landmarks for each to really just try and lock down and get those so it's all under control. So knowing every bone, knowing those key landmarks that help us then know left from right. Now for many of us, this is going to be a work in progress, and we're going to build over the next couple of weeks, but we need to make a really strong, solid start on what those landmarks are, because in a couple of weeks' time, I'm not going to be saying this lump and bump here and there. I'm going to be using the correct anatomical names, so you need to know what I'm going to be talking about.